Hello there tonight. We are going to take a quiet, moonlit walk through the glittering halls of the Palace of Versailles. But don't breathe in too deeply. The chandeliers may sparkle like stars, and the mirrors may stretch into forever. But just under that velvet and gold, there's a sourness. It clings to the air like perfume on old lace. A mixture of rose water and, well, something worse. You're standing at the edge of a marble hallway. The air is still but not clean. It's the kind of stillness that comes after a storm or a spill. And just beside the gilded doorframe, there's a faint, wet stain. Not wine. Something more human. And the worst part, that's normal. Versailles was a palace of illusions. Glitter on the outside, grime on the inside. A place built for gods, but lived in by people who didn't believe in soap. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this strange little story travels. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. It's just before dawn. The great palace sleeps, or at least pretends to. A few candles flicker behind thick velvet curtains, their glow catching on the carved gold edges of mirrors taller than trees. The floor beneath your feet is marble, cool, veined, and ever so slightly sticky. From somewhere deep in the corridor there's a thump, a porcelain chamber pot being set down too roughly, then a muffled curse. You recognize the rhythm already. Versailles is waking up, but not the way we wake up today. Not with showers and soft robes, coffee makers and playlists. Here the morning begins with chamber pots and perfume urine in the corners, and a silence that's somehow too alive. You can smell the day before it begins. The stench is layered. First the sharp tang of ammonia, unmistakable and eye-watering. Then comes the cloying sweetness of orange blossom water, and under that something furry. A little wet, possibly feline. A cat darts past you, silent and thin. It pauses at a tapestry, sniffs it, then disappears into the shadows. You don't want to know what it found. A maid, barely more than a child, is already up gathering linens that smell like they were never truly clean. Her hands are red and cracked. She pulls her apron up to cover her mouth as she walks by a pile of waste someone left by the base of a marble column. She doesn't flinch. She's seen worse. Everyone has. Because at Versailles, filth wasn't an accident. It was built into the schedule. You see this palace. The one we imagine as eternal elegance was more of a theatrical illusion than a real home. King Louis XIV moved the court there to control the nobility, to keep his rivals close. But in doing so, he crammed hundreds of bodies into a space that didn't have enough water toilets or common sense. There were over 2,000 rooms, but hardly any bathrooms. People relieved themselves behind curtains in stairwells, even inside closets that doubled as makeshift toilets. There were official commodes, of course, but even they weren't enough. And when they overflowed, which they often did, the waste seeped into the floorboards. Or worse, the bedrooms next door. One noblewoman once complained that she had to step over two people relieving themselves just to leave her quarters. Historians still debate whether the worst part of Versailles was the lack of privacy or the lack of plumbing, but most agree it smelled like vanity and rot. The morning rituals were no better. The king, the nobles, even the queen, none of them bathed the way we understand bathing. Full immersion in water was seen as dangerous. They believed that hot water opened the pores, allowing disease to creep in, so they avoided it. Instead, they practiced dry hygiene, if you could even call it that. Louis XIV, the son, king himself, is said to have bathed only twice in his life. Instead of soap and water, he favored a cloth soaked in alcohol or floral perfume rubbed gently over the skin. It masked the odor just enough for ceremony, but not enough for comfort. Courtiers did the same. They changed their linen shirts multiple times a day, believing that clean fabric could absorb dirt and odor from the skin. But when there's no bathing, no scrubbing, no real cleansing, well, you can imagine the result. Even the lavish court dress contributed to the problem. Corsets, panniers, velvet, lace, wool layers upon layers of thick, heavy fabric that trapped heat, sweat, and smell. You might spend an hour lacing up your bodice only to sweat through it before lunch. And perfume, oh the perfume. Gallons of it. Rose lavender musk. Orange flower. It was everywhere. On wigs, handkerchiefs, gloves, even furniture. But instead of helping, it only added to the chaos, layering fragrance over filth until Versailles smelled like a rotting bouquet. Walk a little further now. The Hall of Mirrors is empty this early, but echoes with last night's laughter. There's a dark spot by the base of a pillar, a half-eaten fig trampled and forgotten. Nearby, a wine stain on a Persian rug, and something else, something sour. A maid hurries by and fans her face. She's used to it, but that doesn't mean she's immune. Neither are the visitors who often arrived at court wide-eyed and left wide-nosed. An Italian diplomat once said Versailles was so grand it stuns the eyes, and so foul it offends the soul. And yet, people stayed. They endured the smell, the crowding, the damp, the dirt. Because this palace wasn't just a residence, it was a stage. A living theater of political power where appearances mattered more than substance, where a silk ribbon could mean the difference between favor and exile. So the nobles powdered their wigs, stuffed herbs into their sleeves, and tiptoed over chamber pot puddles in embroidered shoes. They smiled through toothaches and lice. They made conversation while someone relieved themselves in the corner, because that's just what you did. Versailles never pretended to be practical, but it was hypnotic. Gold on every ceiling, mirrors to make the rooms seem endless, music drifting from the salons, and beneath it all, the quiet, steady drip of waste behind the curtain. It's morning now. The court is awake. Somewhere a violin begins to play. A servant opens a window, not for fresh air, but to dump the contents of a pot. You hear it splash into the courtyard below. No one flinches. You're in Versailles, and Versailles never truly smelled clean. You hear the rustle of silk before you see him. Louis XIV, the Sun King, is awake. Or rather, he's being awakened like a small sun being relit every morning by the trembling hands of his servants. The ceremony is called La Levée du Roi, the King's Rising, and it is as ridiculous as it is sacred. About 100 people gather quietly in the royal bedroom, waiting to watch him open his eyes. Dukes, physicians, noblemen, and clergy. All there, just to see him. Yawn. He blinks, stretches, maybe scratches a bit. Then he begins his day. But don't picture steam rising from a hot bath or a splash of cold water on his face. The man who would rule the most glamorous court in Europe is not a fan of water. He never has been. Louis XIV, the grand figure you've seen in oil portraits, so poised, so powdered, has famously taken 2 full-body baths in his entire life. Just 2. And we know about both of them because they were considered events. You probably won't survive? His dislike wasn't laziness. It was belief. Like many of his contemporaries, Louis thought that bathing was dangerous, a risky invitation to disease. The logic went like this: water, especially warm water, opened the pores. Open pores made the body vulnerable to infection, to evil spirits, to whatever they feared most that year. So instead of scrubbing, he wiped. Each morning, the king began his hygiene routine with what modern dermatologists might call a gentle cleanse, except without water. A valet would bring in a warmed towel, sometimes soaked in floral alcohol or spirits, and Louis would be dabbed down. Not scrubbed, never scrubbed, just pressed. Especially under the arms behind the knees and wherever his silk shirt would stick during the day. Then came the perfumes. Bottles and bottles, each worth more than a peasant's annual wage. Orange blossom, bergamot, ambergris, rose. He would be massaged with fragrant oils, especially around the neck and chest, so that his scent arrived in the room before he did. A kind of olfactory entourage. He wasn't alone in this. Everyone at Versailles stank gorgeously. Perfume was armor. It cloaked your sins. It whispered, "I don't sweat, I glisten." Women carried scented gloves and lace handkerchiefs soaked in lavender water. Men dusted themselves with powder between the thighs. If you happened to smell fresh bread or bitter herbs, that was deliberate, a trick of the nose, but none of it hid everything. You see, Louis had a problem, or rather a few dozen problems. Skin conditions, digestive issues, possibly even chronic infections. Historians still debate whether his avoidance of bathing made him sick, or whether his sickness justified the avoidance. Either way, he was often ill. And still, he ruled every inch of Versailles. Once the perfume was done, he changed shirts. That might sound ordinary, but at Versailles, changing shirts was a spectacle of wealth. Louis XIV would change 3 to 5 times a day, each time using a fresh linen chemise. Courtiers watched it like theater. In fact, many nobles would jockey for the privilege of handing him his next shirt. Just being allowed to touch his clothing could raise your family's status. The shirt wasn't just about fashion, it was absorption. Since people didn't bathe, they used layers of linen to soak up oils, sweat, and grime. And when the shirt got too rank, they simply changed it. Easy, efficient, revolting. Beneath all this elegance, however, there were shortcuts. Louis rarely cleaned his teeth. Toothbrushes existed, but they weren't widely trusted. Instead, he swished his mouth with wine, or mint, or urine. Yes, really. Some believed urine had cleansing properties. We'll get to that. For shaving, he had a private barber, of course. No razors on royal skin unless wielded by someone trained. His beard was trimmed, his lips oiled, and his eyebrows, well, they were powdered, just like everything else. But the crowning ritual, the one that truly marked the king's readiness, was his wig. Long, curled, heavily powdered, built like a small fortress of horsehair and glue. A servant lifted it gently and placed it on his freshly shaved scalp, careful not to irritate the skin. And in that moment, Louis transformed from a sickly, perfumed man into the Sun King. Funny thing is, all this was public. Versailles didn't do privacy. The king's rising, washing, dressing, even his prayers were all observed. The court was built on visibility. Power was proximity. If you were allowed to watch Louis scratch his leg, you were somebody. If you handed him his scented glove, you had made it. And so his hygiene, such as it was, became a form of theater. A display of grace under odor, of composure under sweat, of divine power, with a faint smell of cheese. It's important to pause here and understand just how much Louis shaped the culture around him. Because when he powdered his wig, everyone powdered theirs. When he wore heels, men followed. And when he said bathing was dangerous, suddenly a whole generation of nobles were rubbing themselves with wine-soaked rags and calling it refined. Even medicine bent to his example. Physicians at court recommended dry cleaning the skin with linen cloths and light friction. Some used vinegar, others used rosewater or milk. The more daring ones used sand, but water never. Too risky, too wild, too peasant. And yet for all this ritual and display, Louis wasn't immune to embarrassment. There's a famous story historians argue whether it's true of a visiting ambassador fainting during a reception, because of the overpowering scent in the room. Not from flowers, but from bodies. The guests had packed themselves in so tightly, wearing so much perfume with so little airflow, that the smell became too much. The king was reportedly unbothered. Or at least he pretended to be. Pretending was everything. And Versailles was the grandest stage of all. So next time you see a painting of Louis XIV, standing tall in silk and silver hand poised on a cane, just remember, beneath that shirt is 3 days' worth of sweat, 2 dabs of rose oil, and a towel that hasn't seen soap since last Christmas. But his collar is spotless, his wig is magnificent, and his smile, well, it's mostly gums, but still, you're not meant to see the grime. You're meant to see the glory. And ignore the faint scent of vinegar and feet. The marble corridors echo with footsteps that aren't trying to be quiet. You can hear them heels, clicking skirts, swishing the occasional scrape of a chair leg, dragged rudely across stone. And somewhere, always somewhere, the sound of liquid hitting stone followed by a sigh of relief. Or a giggle. Sometimes both. Because here at Versailles, privacy is an illusion, and relieving yourself is almost a public sport. Imagine this. You're mid-conversation with a viscount about the latest scandal at court, and he suddenly turns, opens a small door in the wood-paneled wall, and disappears. You hear the unmistakable sound of splashing. You pretend not to. Moments later, he returns, straightening his cuffs. "Where were we?" he asks smoothly. Welcome to courtly bathroom culture where pooping with an audience was not only accepted, but sometimes encouraged. Let's start with the king again. Louis XIV, ever the trendsetter, famously took meetings on the commode. Yes, really. He would sit royally on his personal throne while receiving ministers and courtiers. The chamber was aired with herbs and incense. The servants stood nearby, poised and ready with scented cloths. No one blinked. It was just part of the royal routine, because bodily functions weren't shameful at Versailles. They were inconvenient, but unavoidable. And when you cram hundreds of powdered, perfumed people into a palace without modern plumbing, you quickly learn to stop being precious. Even Marie Antoinette, decades later, couldn't escape the filth. There's an infamous story about her walking through the palace gardens and being struck by flying waste. Some unlucky soul above had dumped their chamber pot out the window without looking. Or maybe they did look. No one ever confessed. Historians still debate whether the act was careless or malicious. Either way, she was not amused. So how did it work? Every courtier's chamber had a chamber pot, of course. Often porcelain, occasionally decorated, rarely cleaned. The higher your rank, the fancier your pot. If you were really lucky, you had a commode chair, a cushioned seat with a hole leading to a discreet container below. It looked elegant. It smelled less so. And when it was full, that's where the servants came in. Pots had to be carried to cesspools, those delightful underground pits, where all the waste went to ferment in peace. Some were close by. Most weren't. So if the weather was bad, or the servant was lazy or overwhelmed, the solution was simple: open the window and toss. This was so common that people walking outside the palace walls learned to hug them, stay alert, and hope for mercy from above. The phrase "Gardez l'eau, watch out for the water" was shouted seconds before the splash. Except sometimes they forgot to shout. Public spaces had latrines too, but they were few and woefully inadequate. Picture a small room with holes carved into benches with no real plumbing below, just gravity and time. With the palace bursting at the seams, these filled up fast. They overflowed, seeped through floorboards, and sent rivers of waste creeping through the palace's lower levels. There's a famous letter from Elizabeth Charlotte, the German-born sister-in-law of Louis XIV. In it, she complains delicately but firmly that it's impossible to leave one's apartment without stepping around someone urinating in a corner. The galleries outside her rooms were treated like public toilets, and no one seemed to care. The Princess d'Harcourt, a formidable figure at court, was particularly infamous for her public peeing. She'd lift her skirt and squat in doorways mid-conversation and carry on as if nothing was happening. And why not Versailles wasn't about modesty. It was about hierarchy. Cleanliness was irrelevant. Status was everything. Servants were expected to clean up eventually. Louis XIV himself ordered weekly cleanings of the more offensive messes, but there were so many people and so much output that the job was never truly done. Instead of fighting the filth, the court learned to live with it. Scented sachets were tucked into pockets and bosoms. Herbs were scattered across floors to mask odors. Incense was burned in the hallways. Windows were thrown open not for beauty or breeze, but desperation. Of course, it didn't always help. The hallways, the stairwells, the hidden alcoves, they all reeked. Some areas of the palace were avoided entirely because the stench was too strong. The Avenue de Saint-Cloud, just outside the gates, was particularly bad. Stagnant water sewage and the occasional dead cat turned it into a smelly moat of misery. Even the court clothing bore the burden. Long trains and heavy hems dragged through corridors streaked with filth. The fabric absorbed everything. That stunning velvet robe the Duchess wore to the ball last night. You wouldn't want to smell it this morning. Still, people came. They lived, laughed, danced, schemed, and yes, relieved themselves all in the same gown. Because Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was the palace, the heart of France, the center of fashion, diplomacy, intrigue, and filth. To live there was to give up comfort for status, to sacrifice hygiene for proximity to power. And if that meant doing your business in a hallway while pretending to admire a tapestry, so be it. You can almost see it now, a nobleman richly dressed pacing the marble floor. He pauses near a curtain, checks that no one of higher rank is watching, and relieves himself into a corner. The smell is strong, but he waves it away. A servant will get it later. Maybe. He adjusts his cuffs, rejoins the conversation, and pretends it never happened. His companion doesn't flinch. She's done the same. Behind them, a maid arrives with a bucket and a rag that's more stain than fabric. She sighs and gets to work, humming under her breath. The bucket sloshes. The rag scrapes. The corridor will be passable again until next time, which could be any minute. The air inside Versailles didn't move. It hung there, stale, perfumed, exhausted, like it had been exhaled by someone 3 days ago and hadn't found its way out yet. And the longer you stood in it, the more it became part of you. It clung to your skin, your hair, your clothes. You could wash your hands in rose water, soak your gloves in violet, tuck a sachet of dried herbs into your corset, and still by noon you'd smell like everyone else, a curious mixture of wealth and rot. Because by this point, the palace had stopped trying to eliminate the stench. It was too late for that. Versailles had a new plan cover it up. They called it the War of the Perfumes, and it was not a metaphor. Every noble servant and social climber at court wore layers of scent, each more elaborate than the last. Orange flower water behind the ears, musk rubbed into the wrists, lavender crushed into hair powder, a little ambergris dabbed on the tongue, yes, the tongue, just in case your breath betrayed your station. And just like that, every room at Versailles became a symphony of competing smells. Not one perfume, but 10, 20, 100, all swirling together. And behind it always the earthy truth of too many humans packed too close with nowhere for their waste to go. It would have been laughable if it weren't so nauseating. You see, the aristocrats of Versailles didn't just dab on cologne for pleasure. They relied on it. They weaponized it. Because they genuinely believed that scent had power not just social, but physical. A strong perfume could protect you, purify the air, ward off sickness. There was a kind of logic to it. The prevailing medical theory at the time was miasma, the idea that disease traveled through bad air. So if the air smelled good, it must be safe. If it stank, it could kill you. Hence the perfume. As historian Alan Corbin once noted, to perfume yourself excessively was seen as both an aesthetic choice and a moral responsibility. If you stank, you weren't just dirty, you were dangerous. You were letting disease fester. And that made you suspect. So the ladies of court layered on rosewater and crushed petals. The gentlemen powdered their wigs with orris root, a fragrant starch made from iris flowers. Some wore perfumed necklaces, beads that slowly released scent as the body heated up. Others pinned fresh herbs to their sleeves, crushed slightly, with each dramatic gesture releasing just enough thyme or mint to distract from the sourness beneath. It almost worked, until it didn't. There were days, especially in summer, when the perfumes began to rot under the heat. When too many bodies in one salon made the room spin. When servants fainted and courtiers blamed it on bad blood rather than bad air. There are letters, real ones, from foreign visitors who describe walking into a ballroom at Versailles and losing their appetite. Not from nerves, from smell. They talk of walls, sweating perfume of floors, sticky with powder, and grease of gowns so saturated in scent that they burned the nose. One ambassador allegedly asked for permission to dine in his carriage, claiming the dining hall was a garden of horrors. Historians still debate whether this was a cultural misunderstanding or a dramatic exaggeration. But if you've ever stood in a small room with too much cologne on too many people, you'll understand the instinct. Even furniture wasn't spared. Chairs, cushions, curtains, everything at Versailles was sprayed, rubbed, soaked, or sprinkled. The result, textiles that looked elegant but carried decades of sweat and scent. If you sat too long on a settee, you stood up smelling like the 5 dukes who sat there before you, and still no one stopped. Because at Versailles, to smell was to be seen. Your signature scent became your signature self. People could recognize a countess by her fragrance before she entered the room. Men flirted not just with glances, but with a whiff. Some nobles wrote entire odes to the perfumes of their lovers. Your breath, like bergamot one, wrote your skin like crushed violets, your hair like the woods in spring. It was deeply romantic. It was also probably untrue. Underneath the poetic haze of roses and sandalwood, there was a problem Versailles couldn't solve. You can't bury rot forever. As the years wore on, the palace began to smell different. Not just crowded, but old, used. It was in the floorboards, in the tapestries, in the seams of gowns passed down from one mistress to the next. Even the gardens, once the pride of the Sun King, began to betray their own decay. Fountains went stagnant. Flowers died in the heat. And the breeze that blew through the hedges carried the faint smell of sour milk and dead leaves. And yet Versailles still dazzled. Foreign dignitaries wrote of being overwhelmed by the palace's grandeur. Gold everywhere, ceilings that looked like heaven, hallways that seemed to go on forever. It was breathtaking, blinding, until you took a breath. The same visitors described keeping handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, pretending it was to hide emotion. In truth, they were fighting back nausea. But the courtiers, they didn't notice anymore. They were used to it. Like people who live next to a bakery and stop smelling the bread, or next to a sewer and stop caring. They had built a palace of beauty on a foundation of waste and covered it all with a thick, sweet cloud of denial. A denial you could smell. And if you dared to question it, if you hinted that perhaps the palace could use fewer rose petals and more mops, you were dismissed. Uncouth, uncultured, probably German. Because Versailles wasn't about truth. It was about illusion. And in that illusion, perfume was king. Which brings us to the strangest irony of all. The very scents that were supposed to mask the decay of Versailles eventually defined it. When historians and archaeologists began studying the palace, one of the most consistent observations wasn't about the architecture or the art. It was about the smell. People still talk about it, whisper about it, and some even say that if you stand in the Hall of Mirrors late at night, when the tourists are gone and the lights are dim, you can still catch a whiff, just the faintest trace of ambergris and mildew lavender and old silk roses and ruin, a ghost scent, the final perfume of a palace that tried to outsmell its own story. Step outside the palace walls just for a moment and follow the winding gravel paths into the woods. The noise of Versailles softens. You hear birds again, the rustle of wind through tall trees, maybe even your own breath finally untainted by incense and unwashed linen. It feels like relief. But don't be fooled, because these woods, this quiet ring of green around the Golden Palace, have secrets of their own. Here among the shadows of oak and elm is where some of the court's most private affairs took place. And we're not talking state secrets. We're talking sex, scandalous, sweaty, often rushed, and not at all discreet. The forest of Versailles was, for all its natural beauty, something of an open-air brothel. Servants knew it. Nobles knew it. Even the king knew it. And depending on the decade, he either ignored it, encouraged it, or hypocritically condemned it. Let's not pretend it was all romance. Sometimes it was power play. Sometimes desperation. Sometimes just boredom. But make no mistake, this palace with all its gilded ceilings and lace gloves had a thriving underbelly of desire. And the trees, oddly enough, were the safest place to act on it. They called them rendezvous gallants, romantic meetings, and they happened everywhere. Behind garden statues, between hedgerows, beneath balconies, and inside abandoned garden pavilions. You might stumble across a countess with her skirts gathered up, a stable boy still buckling his trousers, both of them giggling like schoolchildren. Or not giggling at all. There's a kind of heat to Versailles that has nothing to do with weather. Everyone watched everyone else. Desire was currency, and being wanted could be a strategy as much as a feeling. Love affairs at court weren't just tolerated, they were often expected, especially when the king set the tone. Louis XIV had many mistresses, some official, others whispered about in letters passed hand to hand across salons. His most famous, Madame de Montespan, was the talk of Europe. Beautiful, clever, politically astute, and as her enemies liked to remind people, deeply involved in scandal. Her rival, Madame de Maintenon, played the moral card. Quiet, devout, careful. But even she, historians suspect, was the king's mistress before becoming his secret wife. Go figure. It was a strange contradiction. The king publicly condemned licentious behavior, even sending police to arrest and brand sex workers in Paris. But behind the gates of Versailles, the rules bent like reeds in the wind. Historians still debate whether Louis truly believed in morality, or if he simply believed in control, that pleasure was fine so long as he was the one in charge of it. The palace itself didn't help. Rooms were small. Walls were thin. Privacy was rare. So many liaisons, especially between servants or lower-ranking courtiers, were forced outside to the woods, the stables, or the narrow stone staircases that twisted into forgotten corners. There's even mention in contemporary writings of a midnight alley behind the orangerie, where servants knew they could make arrangements with local sex workers. Candles flickering, silhouettes swaying, then parting quietly before dawn. It wasn't just about lust. It was about escapism. Versailles was an exhausting place. Every smile could be a trap. Every compliment could mask a threat. The etiquette was rigid. The hierarchy suffocating. Sex, even stolen and brief, felt like breathing again. Like control in a world that offered very little of it. And for some women, especially lower-born ones, it was also survival. If a lady's maid caught the eye of a marquis, she might earn a necklace, or a better room, or protection from gossip. If a laundress charmed the right steward, She could avoid dismissal when linens came back torn or stained. Of course, this power was fragile. One whisper could ruin a reputation. One jealous wife could end a career. But it was still something in a world where most women had nothing. And the rumors flew faster than perfume in the Hall of Mirrors. Did you hear about the Duchess and her fencing instructor? I swear I saw the Comte with his valet in the Rose Garden again. I'd be careful around that ambassador. He leaves girls crying. Some stories were true, others weren't. But in a palace that ran on drama, the line between fact and fiction blurred daily. There were even printed pamphlets, illicit of course, filled with court gossip, and erotic drawings smuggled out of Versailles and into the hands of eager readers across Paris. They called them libelles, part tabloid, part scandalous diary, part social weapon. The king tried to suppress them, but they only multiplied. It's easy to laugh at it now. The image of powdered courtiers sneaking into bushes, tripping on their own lace, trying not to crush a rose bush mid-passion. But it wasn't always funny. Sometimes it was messy, painful, dangerous. Affairs led to duels, to blackmail, to unwanted pregnancies that were quietly spirited away in the night, to heartbreaks that lingered under the surface while the violins played and the chandeliers sparkled, and sometimes to nothing at all. Just two people in a shadow searching for warmth, then going back to their rooms and pretending nothing happened. That's the thing about Versailles. It was both stage and cage, a glittering box filled with performance, and beneath it all, very human cravings. No one talked about it, but everyone knew. Even the scent of the forest betrayed them. Sweet magnolia and crushed grass, the faint aroma of sweat, powder, and something else saltier. Lingering, clinging to the stone walls long after they returned to their ballrooms and tea tables. If you walked those woods today at just the right hour, you might still feel it. The ghosts of stolen kisses, the hush of secrets tangled in branches, the crunch of a heel on gravel as someone slips away. Versailles, after all, didn't need darkness to be secretive. It just needed silence. And a garden big enough to lose your sins in. There's a smile in every portrait from Versailles, bright, confident, framed in lace and ribbon. The ladies of court tilt their heads, just so their teeth peeking through painted lips like pearls behind silk curtains. But take a closer look, and you'll notice something off, something just a little too tight about those smiles, a little too careful. Because the truth is, nobody at Versailles wanted to open their mouth too wide. To do so would risk revealing what lay beneath a mouthful of decay. You see, as obsessed as they were with appearance, wigs, perfume gowns, the courtiers of Versailles had rotten teeth. Not just a few here and there, but entire sets of blackened, broken, and missing ones. And it all started with something we still love today, sugar. Refined sugar became widely available in France during the 17th century. And like any new luxury, it was instantly fashionable. Sweet pastries, glazed fruits, candied violets. Sugar wasn't just for eating, it was a sign you'd made it. You could afford excess. You could rot in style. And rot they did. The problem, no toothbrushes. At least not the kind we'd recognize. Dental hygiene was still a mystery, and the remedies were questionable. Some people chewed herbs like mint or parsley to freshen their breath. Others rubbed their teeth with cloth soaked in vinegar or wine. A few daring souls even used ground-up cuttlefish bone or ash or brick dust scrubbing until their gums bled, thinking they were cleaning. But they weren't. By the age of 30, many courtiers had already lost most of their teeth. They smiled carefully, chewed slowly, and avoided speaking when unnecessary. Even the most celebrated beauties at court would whisper behind fans, sip broth through pursed lips, and avoid laughing too loudly. And yet, ironically, perfect teeth were the ultimate beauty standard. One of the most popular texts of the era, the School of Venus, declared that a truly attractive woman should have even and very white teeth. Paintings reflect this ideal, with women shown with pale complexions, rosy cheeks, and delicate smiles. Never open, never real. Historians still debate whether some of these women painted white over their remaining teeth, or whether artists simply did them the favor of imagining what wasn't there. And if that sounds absurd, wait until you hear what they did instead of brushing. Many at Versailles used tooth powders, homemade concoctions of charcoal, crushed shells, salt, and spices. Some worked, most didn't. A few even contained mercury, which made things worse. Far worse. Mouthwash was another gamble. Recipes included wine, honey, vinegar, or even urine, yes, again, with the urine. The belief was that it could kill bacteria and freshen the mouth. And who knows, maybe it did. But no one smelled minty fresh afterward. Even King Louis XIV, the center of all things beautiful and powerful, suffered. He had lifelong dental problems, with records describing purulent decay, bleeding gums, and loose teeth. Eventually, he lost them all. By the time of his death in 1715, the Sun King was entirely toothless, his meals reduced to soft breads and broths. But because this was Versailles, even that had to be elegant. He wore a false palate, a contraption made to shape his face and help him speak clearly. It was padded, painted, and adjusted constantly, but it never truly fit. Courtiers learned to understand his mumbles. Ministers leaned in a little closer than they'd like, and no one dared comment on the change in his speech. It was a royal mouth, after all. The decay didn't stop with teeth. It worked its way downward. The diet at court, rich meats, heavy creams, endless sweets, paired with poor hygiene and constant stress, made for a gastrointestinal nightmare. People suffered from chronic indigestion, gum abscesses, ulcers, and what one noblewoman politely referred to as an internal pestilence. And then there were the worms. Tapeworms, to be specific. Common, painful, and very hard to ignore. Louis XIV himself was reported to have passed a 6-inch tapeworm, a detail recorded with more curiosity than horror by his personal physician. It wasn't a unique case. Many courtiers had intestinal parasites, often contracted from contaminated water or undercooked food, both of which were plentiful at Versailles. The cooks tried their best, but when sewage leaked into the kitchens, when rats ran freely through the pantries, when meat spoiled in the summer heat, well, the worms thrived. And the treatments, wormwood, bitters, starvation, even small doses of arsenic. The goal wasn't always to kill the worm, but to make the host so unpleasant that the parasite fled. The side effects were, as you might guess, dramatic. So there you had it, a palace of jewels and lace with rotting teeth and wriggling parasites hidden beneath the powder. But no one talked about it. Instead, they flirted. They gossiped. They posed for portraits with mouths, firmly closed eyes, painted wide cheeks, pinched rosy with cochineal. You were expected to look alive even if something inside you was slowly dying. And in some cruel twist of fashion, those with the worst teeth often wore the brightest smiles, not out of joy, but out of habit. A tilt of the chin. A flash of pearls, real or fake. A wink. All part of the game. Even as their gums bled. Even as their stomachs twisted. Even as their breath curled wallpaper. Because Versailles wasn't a place for honesty. It was a place for illusion. And if your teeth fell out, well, just powder your lips a little redder and keep smiling. After all, the king had no teeth either. And he still ruled the world. The scratching starts before sunrise. Soft at first, like tiny fingertips drumming against the wood-paneled walls. Then louder, persistent, rhythmic. You might mistake it for mice until you feel the crawling. The wig on your head, so carefully powdered and curled the night before, is moving. Because in Versailles, you didn't just wear your status, you wore your parasites. Let's talk about lice. They were everywhere. In bed sheets, in cushions, in the velvet lining of gloves, and most famously, in the mile-high wigs that graced every noble head from the king to the scullery maid's cousin's mistress. You've seen them in paintings, those towering elaborate confections of curls and powder and bows. Some even sported mini-gardens complete with fake birds and fountains. Others had ships balanced in them, yes, ships, as in tiny boats perched proudly on a lady's scalp, all for a ball honoring a naval victory. But underneath the silk flowers and ostrich feathers was a battlefield. The human scalp was a buffet, and lice feasted like courtiers at a royal banquet. Now here's the clever part. Wigs weren't just fashionable, they were strategic. Men especially would shave their heads bald to keep lice off their real hair. The idea was simple: lice would infest the wig, not the scalp, and wigs, unlike heads, could be boiled. So once a month, sometimes once a week, the wigs would be collected and cooked, steamed, scalded, scoured. A hot bath the people themselves avoided, but happily gave their hairpieces. Historians still debate whether this made things better or worse. Because while the wigs were being cleaned, the bare heads were exposed to cold, to dust, to other people's bugs. And not all wigs were treated equally. The wealthier you were, the more wigs you owned, which meant more rotation, more cleanliness, less crawling. The poor, they got the leftovers. In the servants' quarters, wigs were shared, sometimes by 3 or 4 people, passed around like cast-offs, rarely cleaned, always itchy, powdered again and again to hide the smell. And the lice didn't care whose head they landed on. Women, unfortunately, didn't benefit from the same system. Most noble women didn't shave their heads, they kept their hair long styled and pinned, which meant lice didn't have to wait for a borrowed wig. They could just dig in. So the ladies powdered and powdered and powdered. The white dust you see in portraits isn't just fashion, it's camouflage. A way to mask the grease, the smell, and the itching. Powdering wasn't a gentle sprinkle either. It was aggressive, flour-like. Applied with giant puffs made of down feathers, sometimes mixed with ground starch, or even lead, yes, lead. The powder coated everything: hair, shoulders, eyebrows, sometimes the air itself. Imagine a crowded salon where dozens of people are adjusting their wigs, brushing their sleeves, patting down stray curls. Every movement sends up little clouds of dust. You inhale it. You taste it. You blink it out of your eyes. And if someone sneezes, you're next. To keep the wigs in place, they used pomade, a greasy mixture of animal fat and beeswax, sometimes scented with herbs or flowers. It gave the wigs shape. It made them shine. It also became the perfect environment for lice to thrive. Warm, moist, delicious. There are even reports of courtiers waking up to find nests in their wigs. Tiny clusters of eggs nestled in the curls. Entire colonies. And what did they do? They powdered it, perfumed it, smoothed it with a comb, and wore it to dinner. Because the worst thing at Versailles wasn't infestation. It was humiliation. To admit that your hair was unclean, that your scalp itched, that something had laid eggs in your curls, that would be social suicide. Better to endure, to itch in silence, to smile through the crawling. They even had special scratching sticks. Long, thin tools made of ivory or silver, sometimes tucked discreetly into a sleeve or bodice. If you saw a duchess idly adjusting her hairpiece with a delicate wand, she wasn't being flirtatious. She was fighting for her sanity. Of course, not all lice stayed in the hair. There were body lice, too, and fleas and mites. The palace cats helped a little by catching rats, but they brought their own share of pests. One flea could leap from a feral cat to a nobleman's stocking, and from there, well, Versailles was a playground. People scratched themselves raw. They blamed the heat, the fabric, the wine, anything but the bugs. And they kept going, dancing, flirting, plotting, as though their skin wasn't crawling under all that silk. The hygiene rituals around wigs were elaborate. Some people stored theirs in glass cases with little sachets of lavender. Others hung them on carved heads like trophies. A few even hired wig caretakers, special servants, who did nothing but brush style and sanitize their master's towering coiffure. And yet, despite all this effort, the lice always returned. They came in with the new valet, with the borrowed shawl, with the foreign ambassador who hugged a little too close. You couldn't stop them. You could only manage them. So the court learned to live with it. Like everything else at Versailles, it became a performance. You didn't say I have lice. You said my hair requires attention. You didn't complain about itching. You reached for your scratching stick with a yawn and murmured, "These wigs, so tiresome." And when your scalp bled, you dabbed it with rose water and smiled. That was the way of things. Style over substance. Powder over parasites. Silence over shame. You wonder as you picture the halls of Versailles what it must have smelled like after a ball. Dozens of powdered wigs now sagging. Pomade melting under candlelight. Powder caking in the folds of lace. Scratching. Always scratching. A room of beautiful people. Crawling. You almost admire their commitment. And the next time you see a portrait, from the period, a marquise with perfect curls, a countess with a ship in her hair, remember what they're not showing. The discomfort, the itch, the tiny empire of bugs living just above the ears. Because for all its glamour, Versailles was a palace where you wore your crown on a nest and prayed it didn't hatch before supper. Follow the scent of rosemary and meat, and you'll eventually find it tucked deep beneath the grandeur behind a door that's always slightly ajar, the royal kitchens. Or rather, the maze of smoke-filled sweating chaos that passed for the royal kitchens at Versailles. You'd think, wouldn't you, that in a palace of such staggering beauty, the food would be a miracle-plated perfection, carved swans, trays of jewels disguised as tarts. And to be fair, the menus were extravagant. But what they don't tell you is that everything came with a side of parasites. Let's step inside. The first thing that hits you isn't the scent of food. It's the stench of damp, stone-spoiled milk and burnt lard. The ceilings are blackened from years of fire and grease. Rats scurry under tables. The floor is slick. A cat sleeps in the corner unmoved by the shouting. And oh, the shouting! Dozens of cooks and assistants yelling over each other. Metal clanging, fires roaring. Someone drops a pot and curses loud enough to echo off the walls. This is where dinner for kings begins, and sometimes it's where kings get sick. Take Louis XIV. He was a man of appetite. Legend says he could eat 4 plates of meat in a single sitting, followed by roast fowl cheese fruit and an absurd amount of wine. The kind of meal that required hours of cooking layers of seasoning to disguise questionable freshness and multiple people to lift the dishes to his chamber. And it all started here in a room without proper plumbing. You see, Versailles wasn't built with sanitation in mind. Remember, it started as a hunting lodge. No one thought they'd be feeding hundreds of nobles, diplomats, and royal offspring every day. So the kitchens grew like tumors added here and there, dark, windowless, and hopelessly overcrowded. Water had to be hauled in by bucket, often stale and sitting too long. The waste had to be carried out the same way, which meant more often than not, it wasn't carried out at all. Just pushed aside, or worse, poured into the floor drains that backed up on rainy days. And those rats you saw earlier, they weren't a nuisance. They were residents. Some kitchens kept cats to catch them. Others didn't bother. The vermin outnumbered the staff, and what they didn't eat they contaminated. Bread, meat, dried fruit. You name it. Now add to that the reality that much of the food came from far away, delivered in carts over dusty, bumpy roads. By the time it reached Versailles, it had been jostled, warmed, and occasionally pecked at by birds along the way. Not every bite was fit for a king, but if it looked nice on the plate and smelled passable, it made it to the table. Historians still debate whether the cooks truly understood the dangers of foodborne illness, or if they simply accepted it as inevitable. Because illness was frequent. Stomach cramps, vomiting, bloating, and diarrhea, they weren't unusual. They were a rhythm of palace life, sometimes blamed on bad wine, sometimes on the weather, never on the sanitation. And yet meals continued, lavish, endless, and full of danger. Even Marie Antoinette, decades after Louis XIV, wasn't spared. There's a particularly foul incident one day. Sewage backed up into her private kitchen. The food was spoiled. The staff tried to clean it, replate it, perfume it. But the queen still fell ill. Word spread. Some said it was a bad chicken. Others swore they saw rats swimming in the soup cauldron. The truth, likely a combination. And parasites don't get us started. Tapeworms thrived at Versailles. Brought in with undercooked pork, unwashed greens, or contaminated hands. There were no gloves, no thermometers, just instinct, speed, and pressure. Courtiers often suffered from fatigue, bloating, strange cravings, symptoms they blamed on humors or vapors. But really, it was something living inside them. Louis XIV, remember, had a famous run-in with one such worm, 6 inches long. Expelled one morning during what was likely a very undignified visit to the royal commode. His doctor wrote about it as if describing the weather. It was just another fact of life at court. And yet, the food was beautiful. Roasted quail glazed with honey, pastries shaped like stars, spun sugar sculptures delicate as lace. Everything made to impress, and often everything deadly beneath the shine. You wonder if they knew, if the young pastry apprentice, elbow-deep in cream and sweat, realized that the milk had turned just a little too sour. If the steward tasting the sauce noticed the metallic tinge from the copper pot. If the butler lifting the silver tray thought, maybe this isn't quite safe before delivering it with a bow. But no one said anything. Because in Versailles, presentation mattered more than digestion. You could be doubled over with cramps, but if you smiled and complimented the duck, you were playing the game correctly. There's something deeply surreal about it. The theater of mealtime. How everyone pretended their silver spoons weren't tarnished, their napkins weren't hiding nausea. How even the sickest courtiers showed up to dinner because missing a meal meant missing visibility. And being visible at court was everything, so they suffered quietly, sipped wine to numb the discomfort, dabbed sweat from their brows, ate lightly when possible, greedily when hungry, carefully always. The kitchens remained, no matter who ruled, no matter who vomited afterward. The grease kept thickening on the walls. The floors stayed slippery, and every now and then a cat would drag something unidentifiable across the tiles, and the cook would chase it off with a cleaver, because dinner service was in an hour, and a king does not wait. You wonder, standing now in this imagined heat, if anyone truly enjoyed their meals. If pleasure outweighed anxiety. If the flavors lingered longer than the symptoms. Or maybe they didn't care. Because when you're dressed in diamonds, seated under chandeliers, surrounded by powdered men and painted women, the illusion of luxury is often more important than the reality of digestion. And if that means a worm or two, so be it. It was Versailles, after all, where even the food wore a disguise. Versailles should never have existed where it did. Let's be clear. As far as real estate goes, the Sun King picked the worst spot imaginable to build his glittering palace of illusions. No river nearby, no natural spring, no decent drainage, just a marshy mess of unstable earth, surrounded by stagnant water and fields that turned to mud with the first sign of rain. And yet Louis XIV saw destiny, or at least control. He didn't want a palace that made sense. He wanted one that made a statement. And that meant taking an old hunting lodge far from Paris and turning it into the most powerful, theatrical, and foul-smelling royal residence in the world. You can still feel it in the stone today, that uneasy sense that the ground doesn't quite want to hold the weight of all that gold. But the builders went ahead anyway. They paved over marshes, filled in swamps, dug foundations into shifting sand. Not metaphorically, actual shifting sand. It moved, it sunk, it resisted, and so did the water underneath. As Versailles expanded new wings, new fountains, new rooms, the pressure on the land grew unbearable. You might imagine that the architects had a grand plan, some sweeping vision. They didn't. Versailles was built in layers like a child, adding blocks wherever there's space. That's why the corridors twist unexpectedly. That's why some windows look out into blank walls. It's why half the chimneys don't line up with fireplaces. It's beautiful. It's impressive. It's also deeply impractical. And the worst part, no one was allowed to say so. Because Louis XIV wasn't just building a palace. He was building a trap. Versailles was designed to keep the nobility under control. By relocating the royal court far from Paris, he stripped the aristocracy of their influence and forced them to live under his gaze. Every hallway, every bedroom, every corridor was part of an elaborate system of surveillance disguised as elegance. But the price of that control was filth. With more than 3,000 residents, including courtiers, servants, guards, and children, the palace became a crowded, heaving organism. And without proper plumbing or waste disposal, it simply couldn't cope. Water had to be hauled in barrels. Sewage had to be carted out, or worse, left to pool behind false walls or beneath floorboards. Rain turned courtyards into cesspools. Dry weather brought the stench of decay wafting up from the bowels of the palace. Every improvement made things worse. Take the fountains. They're stunning, of course, dozens of them spraying arcs of water across symmetrical gardens. But they drained poorly. They overflowed. And the same stagnant water often circulated for weeks, turning ponds into mosquito breeding grounds and green sludge gardens. There's a particularly grim anecdote from the reign of Louis XV. A newly installed sewage pipe meant to direct human waste away from the palace instead burst under the east wing, flooding a series of storage rooms and soaking the base of the Queen's dressing chamber. The smell lasted months. The walls never quite recovered. Even the air seemed to rebel. In summer, the stench became unbearable. The sun would bake the palace grounds, lifting the scent of urine manure and rotting food into every open window. Courtiers carried pomanders, and scented fans pressed them to their faces as they crossed courtyards or simply held their breath until the next salon. In winter, the problem reversed. The chill trapped the smells indoors, and the fires that were meant to keep the palace warm just cooked the stink into the drapes. Servants tried. Really, they did. But Versailles produced more filth than could be cleaned. Linens had to be boiled and beaten with lye. Floors scrubbed with vinegar. Walls aired. But nothing was ever enough. And over time, the filth became part of the palace. It sank into the tapestries, into the velvet cushions, into the silk wall coverings, into the foundations themselves. You might think, why not build another palace? Why not rotate between residences like kings before him? But Louis didn't rotate. That was the old way, the medieval way. His predecessors had moved from castle to castle, allowing each to rest, to recover, to be cleaned. But Louis stayed put, because staying put meant power. He was the sun, and the court orbited him. That meant Versailles had to endure the full weight of its residents every day, every night, every private moment. There was no relief, no break, no time for reset. Just a constant buildup of filth behind the curtains of splendor. And still they came. Foreign dignitaries, ambassadors, nobles, artists, all eager to see the miracle of Versailles. all blinded by the mirrors and the gold, and all too polite or too terrified to mention the smell. Some found excuses to leave early. Others developed sudden headaches. A few fainted from the heat or from whatever was rising out of the hallway carpets. But no one ever questioned the location, because Versailles wasn't just a building, it was a performance. A declaration that France was so powerful, so untouchable, that it could build its court in a swamp and still have the world bow to it. It's almost impressive, really, until you realize the human cost. The servants who collapsed from heat and ammonia. The children who developed coughs that never went away. The cooks who slipped on mold-covered tiles. The maids who carried chamber pots up 5 flights of stairs, only to be told to do it again because the king was having guests. And beneath all of that, the earth kept shifting. Foundation stones cracked. Walls sagged. Floors warped. More than once, a part of the palace had to be quietly demolished and rebuilt because the soil had given way beneath it. But they never moved. They just built more, added wings, added salons, added gardens, covered the rot with gold. And to this day, Versailles still stands. Miraculously, a palace built on bad ground, supported by impossible ambition, and held together somehow by the stubborn refusal to acknowledge its flaws. It's a metaphor, isn't it? For monarchy, for empire, for any system that prioritizes image over reality. Because you can build a throne room on a swamp, you just can't stop it from sinking. Step outside the palace gates just for a moment. The gold fades from view. The noise of courtly chatter, rustling skirts, and snide whispers dissolves behind you. But the scent, the scent still lingers. It clings to your cloak, your gloves, the hem of your embroidered trousers. Versailles doesn't let go that easily, and neither do the cats. They're everywhere, in the alleys, on the rooftops, behind garden urns, and under the seats of royal carriages. Feral and domestic, skinny and spoiled, they prowl the palace grounds like silent sentries. And in a strange way, they are the unseen guardians of Versailles. But make no mistake, they weren't pets. Not in the modern sense. Sure, some ladies kept lap cats with jeweled collars and names like Biscuit or Pomponette, but the vast majority were working animals tolerated for one reason: they ate rats. And there were plenty of rats. The palace, as we've seen, was not exactly sanitary. Leftover food, rotting meat, spilled milk, half-eaten tarts discarded beneath tapestries, Versailles was a smorgasbord for vermin. Every cellar, every pantry, every disused hallway practically buzzed with activity after dark. The cats were essential. And yet they were also part of the problem. Because when you have hundreds of half-wild cats roaming the halls doing their feline duty, you inherit a new kind of filth. Cat droppings appeared in hallways, on balconies, even in the Queen's garden paths. Visitors occasionally slipped on them. More than one ambassador's letter includes a polite complaint veiled as a poetic metaphor. The path to diplomacy is slippery, as I discovered near the West Wing, where a silent guardian had left his mark. And when the cats died, they were rarely buried. Some were kicked into ditches, tossed into bushes, or simply left where they fell. You can imagine what that did to the already tragic air quality. One of the most infamous locations was the Avenue de Saint-Cloud, a long stretch of road just outside the palace grounds. It should have been beautiful, tree-lined, wide, grand. But instead, it became a dumping ground. Stagnant water pooled at its edges. Rotting food and animal corpses piled up in shadows. And in the summer, the scent could make a grown man retch. Even the royal staff avoided it when possible. And yet, life went on. Nobles rode past it in carriages. Children played nearby. Lovers whispered along its walls. Versailles had taught them all the same trick: ignore the filth, elevate the fantasy. And speaking of fantasy, have you ever heard of puce? It's the color of history's oddest fashion trend. The word puce in French literally means flee. Not flee as in running away, but flea as in the insect. The kind that bites. The kind that lives in wigs under skirts and, yes, on those cats we just talked about. So how did a flea become a fashion? Well, in 1775, Queen Marie Antoinette wore a gown to court that caused a stir. It was a strange shade, a purplish brown, slightly gray, like a bruise halfway to healing. Her husband, Louis XV, glanced at it and reportedly said, "That's the color of un puce, a flea." And just like that, the court went wild. Everyone wanted it. Old flea, young flea, flea belly, flea back. The fashion houses scrambled to give names to all the variations. It was a bizarre moment of luxury born from something Versailles usually tried to hide. Historians still debate whether Marie Antoinette found the comparison amusing or insulting. But she wore the color again and again. So did everyone else. Soon the palace hallways were filled with nobles strutting in shades of vermin, and that wasn't even the strangest naming choice. In 1781, when Marie Antoinette gave birth to the heir, the little Dauphin, the court decided to celebrate with a new color. They called it caca Dauphin. Yes, Dauphin poop, a rich, velvety brown inspired allegedly by the royal newborn's excrement. And once again, the court embraced it. Gowns, ribbons, upholstery, even gloves were dyed this festive hue. Because what could be more fashionable than dressing yourself in the color of princely poop? It sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous. But Versailles thrived on symbolism, on spectacle, on finding elegance in the absurd. You could say that was its coping mechanism. When your walls smell like mildew and your water tastes like copper, and there's a dead cat in the courtyard, sometimes the only thing left to do is name a dress color after facies and call it couture. The palace absorbed it all. The dirt, the decadence, the dead cats and the flea-inspired fabrics. And in some twisted way, it was consistent. Versailles was never truly clean, but it was always dressed for the occasion. Even in its final decades, as revolution whispered through the countryside, the palace continued to pretend. Balls were held, wigs were powdered, gowns in caca Dauphin were swirled across parquet floors, until they weren't, until the gates opened to crowds no longer dazzled, until the mirrors reflected anger instead of admiration, until the stink became more than metaphor. It's said that long after the monarchy fell, visitors still came to Versailles expecting glory, and what they found was a smell. Not overpowering, not immediate, but subtle, lingering, as if the air itself remembered. A little perfume, a little damp fur, a little something worse, a final exhale from a palace that tried to outglitter its own decay. You might laugh now at the absurdity of it all. The golden rooms, the crawling wigs, the dresses named after fleas, the endless perfume wars, and the rivers of filth behind brocade curtains. But there's something human there too, a kind of fragile beauty, a desperate, ridiculous attempt to be more than the mud we're built on. Versailles wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it reached for something impossible maybe, but dazzling all the same. And in the end, that's what lingered. Not just the rot, but the dream. So now, as the halls grow quiet again and the candles melt low, you can almost feel Versailles slipping back into shadow. The gold loses its gleam. The perfume fades. The mirrors reflect only darkness. And the rustling behind the curtains. That's probably just the wind. Probably. Close your eyes and picture it now, the grand staircase, empty, the chandeliers swaying gently overhead. Somewhere a cat curls up on a forgotten cushion. A servant snores softly behind a half-shut door. And the palace for once seems to breathe slowly. Whatever else it was, dirty, dazzling, ridiculous Versailles was alive. And now it sleeps. So let it. Let the past fold in on itself like velvet in a drawer. Let the sounds soften the lights dim and the scents fade to something you can't quite name. You're safe now. You're warm. And you made it through another strange little story.